Pride. Hi, my name is Reed Silverne. The name of the show is Fed Pride. The reason it's called Fed Pride is because I'm a federal worker and retired and proud of it. In the last couple of weeks, federal workers have been getting a lot of attention because there's been a terrible government shutdown. Today, for me, it's October 18th. It's a Friday. For you, it's probably the 22nd or the 26th or sometime in November. So you'll be looking backward into time at me and whatever I'm talking about on the 18th of October. Now, that won't be such a big deal this month, but last month I was talking about that there might be a government shutdown. And if you saw the show, there was a government shutdown and practically a default. So a bunch of people did a bunch of stupid things, and I'll talk about them a little bit, and then I'll talk about another issue that I brought up last month as well. Okay, so what finally happened? Last we heard, or at least from my show, Ted Cruz was going to filibuster, and then I found an article that basically says he can't filibuster. All he can do is delay the vote for 30 hours. And he had a faux filibuster of 21 hours where he talked all night along with another right-wing Republican senator, another Tea Party guy. So there's two big Tea Party guys in the Senate right now. It's Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is a freshman senator from Texas, and he's a grandstander of the highest order. His father was a preacher. He looks like this all the time. He looks up like he's looking to heaven. And so he got on TV and he talked about Dr. Zeus and all these other things. But the whole idea was to prevent the outroll of Obamacare. And he had organized a micro-caucus among the Republicans in the House, who were all Tea Party guys, to have a strategy to defund Obamacare. And their strategy, in short, was they were not going to pass a continuing resolution. At least the continuing resolution that they passed had a clause in it that said that they would defund Obamacare. So he forced that through. Boehner, the Speaker of the House, was against it. And then after that, he was for it. Boehner constrains himself with something called the Hastert Rule. The Hastert Rule says, even if I can pass a bill with Democratic votes and a few Republican votes, I won't bring it to the floor unless it has, in my opinion, a count of a majority of the Republican caucus. So the Republicans completely control the House. So it went to the House. They passed this bill, but because the Senate was going to strike it out, which they did the next day, and that was September 27th, I believe, what they were going to do was put another constraint, or a ransom, as the Democrats called it, into the next version of the continuing resolution. Now, what's a continuing resolution? In a normal year, the Congress, both the House and the Senate, go through a budget process, and they go through budget committees. They pass budgets for each area, and then it goes through appropriations, and then they finally vote on a budget. And then they have a conference, and in that conference, they decide on a budget. Well, this was the first time in many years that the Democrats in the Senate actually passed a budget. But certain senators prevented a budget reconciliation, which is some members of the House, some members of the Senate, if the two bills are different, reconcile it, and then they send it to the president. And all this happens in a normal year before the end of the fiscal year, which is September 30th of any year. Well, since 2010, when the Republicans took over the House, there hasn't been a budget reconciliation of any kind in any one of the years. So basically, what's been happening is a continuing resolution is passed, and that continuing resolution means that we are going to continue to fund the government at the level that it's currently funded. And that's routine. That happens every year, at least every year that there's not a budget. And but this year is unusual because even the farm bill didn't pass the House. I mean, the Republicans are in complete disarray, and there's a certain set of Republicans that just hate government, and they get in the way of any reasonable agreement on anything. So this has been a very difficult year for the Speaker of the House, who's John Boehner, and the House has accomplished nothing as usual since this has happened. I'm going to put this on Washington, D.C. So what they were going to do is they were going to pass a continuing resolution, but they were going to put a binder on it or an amendment that said, first, we're going to defund Obamacare. That didn't work out. It got blocked in the Senate by Reid. Then they were going to postpone it for a year. Then they were going to do something else. But they were always trying to attach a ransom to it. And basically, the Democrats in the Senate, who control the Senate and can table any resolution coming from the House and not pass it, the president and everybody else said, government by ransom has got to stop. I'm not negotiating until you pass the continuing resolution, then I'll be happy to negotiate. But then when they negotiate, Republicans have no leverage. Why do they have no leverage? They control one house, and they don't, and the Tea Party doesn't even control that portion, that half of the house. So they don't have a lot of leverage unless something really serious was going on. And in this case, it was the end of the fiscal year. An absolute continuing resolution was necessary. And within a couple weeks, the debt limit needed to be raised because the government was going to run out of borrowing authority. And that's a long story, that goes since 2011. But there that story is. So the Democrats agreed to pass a clean continuing resolution at sequester levels, which means very, very low spending levels for discretionary spending. And the Republicans had to attach something. It finally got to the point where they just wanted to screw their own staff and aides and take their health insurance away from it, or at least the government contribution to their health insurance. So I'm sure they really appreciated that. You had to be a real loyal aide, a Tea Party aide, when your boss says, I'm cutting your health insurance, and I'm going to end up giving you a net reduction in salary. And that's my demand to reopen the entire government. So the government shut down, and they shut down the parks, they shut down the monuments, and Cruz's little mini party over there, his idea was, anything that people are upset about, we'll pass a continuing resolution just about that. So we'll reopen the National Institute of Health. We'll reopen the monuments. Anything that people are upset about, we'll reopen. But we'll keep the rest of the government closed. Well, that didn't buy anything because the Democrats were actually very united about that. So every time they took a partial continuing resolution, it got tabled in the Senate, and the president said, I'm not buying it. So they were getting more and more frustrated. People were very, very angry. Tea Party congressmen were busy breaking open the barricades to the memorials on the mall near the Congress building. And even the vets who were having groups come in were getting annoyed that they were being used as props by people who were obviously not very patriotic in the first place, because they're endangering national security by sending 350,000 defense workers off the job. And also almost all of the workers who work for NSA, CIA, and all these other agencies. And every time something shut down, they would say, that terrible president, how dare he shut this down, since we didn't fund it. Finally, the Secretary of Defense said, we're sending all the defense workers back to work, but without a salary until after the shutdown is over. The shutdown lasted 16 days. Now, what I don't know is whether it's kind of a weird deal in the government. There's a pay period, and the pay period is 2 weeks long. So I don't know whether the pay period was the point between the two weeks of the shutdown, or whether it was at the end. If it was at the end, then they didn't get their paycheck, but it would be coming the following week. If it was in the middle, they went through a week when they didn't get paid, and there were bills that they were unable to pay. One of the Republican congressmen said, you feds, you worthless people, I don't know what the heck you do, why don't you go get a loan? Yeah, participate in the private economy. Go get a loan. Get yourselves in debt just because we're being jerks and shutting down the government. So that guy finally apologized, because he realized that some of his own constituents in his red state were actually federal workers, because he had bases in his district. And he got a few calls, or they didn't take calls, but they had messages. And people messaged him and said, you threw me out of work for 2 weeks, you friggin' guy. And now you're telling me to go get a loan from a payday loan company at ridiculous rates. So the whole thing was a mess. Polls came in. And basically, they thought, the president would be blamed because we tried to pass these limited bills, and whatever anybody was upset about, we tried to open up. But it didn't work out that way. The president's rating went down anyway because he was presiding over a mess. But theirs went down to just the Tea Party people. So one poll had the Republican support at 28%, favorable at 28%. Another poll had it at 24%. Another poll had the Republican favorables at 18%. But the unfavorables were over 60 to 70. And even before the shutdown, the polls all said 70% of the people don't want a shutdown due to Obamacare. They want Obamacare to just keep on going. If it doesn't work, then you can criticize it. Well, the irony of the whole thing is, while every day they were focusing on this mess in Congress and this back and forth, and the hundreds of thousands of people are furloughed, and a lot of people are about to get less and less services. In fact, the first week, there were some of our guys, our military killed in Afghanistan. Their death benefits for their families were delayed because there was no funding for it. So both sides passed that. That was one of the few limited continuing resolutions that passed. So that was upsetting. And then if it had gone on past the day that it did, the following Monday, the thousands and thousands of veterans would not have gotten their checks, their disability checks. So the whole thing was a complete mess, complete own goal, complete, bad management, I guess is the easiest way to say it. And what was it for? Well, it was to stop Obamacare. But it didn't stop Obamacare. So finally, there were a whole bunch of things. The Republicans all of a sudden didn't care about Obamacare. They cared about limiting spending. But of course, the clean continuing resolution was at sequester levels. So that had brought discretionary spending down $200 billion and cut that out of the following year's deficit. So how much more do you want to do since you got that $200 billion from the last crisis? The House wanted to do an extension conditioned on Obama bargaining over spending cuts to reopen the government. Obama said, he called a big meeting, all the Republicans showed up, and he said, I'm not negotiating on anything. He said, you pass the clean continuing resolution, and then we'll talk. You give away all your leverage, and then we'll talk, because you creating a fake crisis, and throwing our people out of work, and limiting our ability to have a good government is not leverage. That's just blackmail, and I'm not giving into it. So finally, a bipartisan group, mostly Republicans, Susan Collins said, if you delay certain medical device tax, and if you do this and if you do that, then we'll pass a continuing resolution. We'll put the House in a position where they're isolated and they'll have to pass it too. Meanwhile, the debt limit is getting closer and closer, and there was a big gathering of big Republican donors who filter their money through the Karl Rove and through the Chamber of Commerce, a lot of billionaires and finance people. And some of them just went right up to their Republican congressman counterpart and said, I'm out of here. I'm not giving you a penny if you're going to be this way. You are going to hurt my business. You're going to hurt my economy that I'm dependent on, and you can forget about it. It's not going to happen. So the pressure started up that was outside the Tea Party. Now, what exactly is the Tea Party? Well, the Tea Party is the AstroTurf that's been put together by a bunch of groups, Americans for Prosperity and Freedom Works and Heritage Action and Heritage Foundation. But the fact of the matter is, there was a group called Heritage Partners, and they were funneling $236 million a cycle through to all these other organizations that all had different names, all came from the Koch brothers and Koch Industries. So the Koch brothers have $50 billion, but that's their net worth. That's not their income. So we don't know what their income is, or whether they get, they can't just write checks off of their company, although they did make their company write a few millions of those. But for the most part, you know, they're coming up with $230 million a year out of their own hides, and they're intent on taking over the Republican Party and the government eventually. So all these different groups put pressure on the Republican congressman. You got to hold firm. You better get rid of Obamacare. If you pass a continuing resolution that does anything less, we're going to mark you down. And meanwhile, the same congressmen, or at least the sane Republican congressmen, are hearing from billionaires, literally billionaires, and much bigger billionaires too, in the finance industry and manufacturing and all these other industries. And they're saying, if you mess with the debt limit, and this thing isn't over by the day of the debt limit, we're out of here. You know, the Koch brothers is all the money you're going to get next turn, because we're out of here. We don't believe in the Republican Party anymore. So this was a tough situation. So finally, the last strokes of the whole thing. The Republicans, McConnell, who's the Republican minority leader, and Reid, who's the Democratic majority leader, has a lot of power, controls the Senate basically. They get together and they pass what is almost an increase to the debt limit for 4 months, a continuing resolution for 3 months that's almost clean. I think it had one tiny little rider that nobody cared about. So in order to prevent this, the Republicans in the House, they get together and they want to pass a resolution with a few riders in it. One of the kind of funnier riders is they want to screw their own staff members, and of course the Democratic staff members too, which I'm sure they're happy to do, out of the employer contribution to their health insurance. Yeah, that's going to make me work overtime for you, you fool. And I've known people who worked on the Hill, and they, some of them make a decent amount of money. None of them make a lot, and some of them just have very, very small salaries. And if they did go on Obamacare, they'd probably get a discount. And previously they were on federal employee health benefit, which is the same one that the federal workers are on, which of course has an employer contribution to your health insurance, just like most health insurance that's through your employer. So that was, to me, an irony that they had to go and screw their own people. It just shows how mean-spirited these people are. And that collapsed because the Republican Tea Party members wouldn't support it, and the Democrats said no. So the final result, the day that the debt limit is coming due, the October 17th or October 16th, the day it's going to expire at the end of that day. The Senate comes together. They beat Ted Cruz and said, "You're not going to delay this. If you do, you're never going to sit in a committee again. And you're never going to get consideration for a bill. And as far as we're concerned, your Senate career is going to be grandstanding to the press and sitting in the corner." So he didn't stop it. And they sent a pretty clean continuing resolution and debt ceiling to the House, and the House ended up passing it with Democratic votes. They got 78 Republican votes and 200, just under 200 Democratic votes. So basically, Nancy Pelosi ended up having to save the day for Boehner and the Republicans. So that's the story of this crazy shutdown. Now, what are the results? The results are that there's supposed to be a super committee, just like in 2011, that's going to solve all of our budget problems forever. They're supposed to complete their work and issue a report by December 13th. And a month later, the continuing resolution ends, and then February 6th or February 7th, the debt ceiling ends. Now, the thing about the debt ceiling, though, is that they tried to put a rider that said that the Secretary of the Treasury, whose name is Jack Lew, who's kind of a genius, couldn't do extraordinary measures to push out that date. And that did not get in there. So basically, he could do anything he wants. So he's, now that the debt ceiling's been set, and it wasn't set at a specific level, so he can basically go ahead, he can issue bonds up to the level of spending from at least 2013, possibly to January 2014. And then he can do what he's been doing, which is to not pay the Social Security Fund, issue bonds to pay the Social Security Fund, and so on and so forth, to keep the level below whatever the continuing resolution, whatever the debt ceiling is. And that debt ceiling has now risen, but we don't know to how much. So probably the debt ceiling is not going to come due until about a month before the elections. And I'm sure they're going to dare the Republicans to create a crisis then. Thank you very much. That's my show.